shadows in the dark. Don't trust what you cannot see. Touch your skin and call your name.
All right.
Just the past that looks back at me.
Hello, everybody. It's CheeseSlice. Welcome for another episode of Left on Left. This is actually pre-recorded this week because of taking a couple weeks off, but more news shows for you. So today we got a special episode with Gloria and Jeremy. We're going to be talking about how the anti-war movement needs a grassroots movement to become more of an anti-imperialist movement. So without further ado, here's Gloria and Jeremy. We're going to be recording another hour for the radio for WBAI and the Progressive Radio Network, and it's Gloria's show. So
Hey, Jayme and Jeremy, long time no see.
Yeah, long time no see. Well, that's just fun how this stuff works, and it's like time traveling. All right, let's get to it, and I'm going to set the clock, and you can take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jeremy is a professor at Tulsa Community College, a historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme, CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Listeners should form their own opinions. Today's show is on the need to develop a united anti-imperialist movement, especially as President Trump glorifies foreign invasion and occupation by praising former U.S. President and colonizer-in-chief William McKinley. As some within the so-called left consider themselves anti-imperialists, admiration for McKinley is seen as ignorant and self-righteous, white supremacist greed, whereas the so-called right remain clueless to the crimes of imperialism at home and abroad, even though many in Trump's base consider themselves truthers and are opposed to state crimes, lies, cover-ups, and the continued loss of constitutional rights and privileges. Both political camps are brainwashed to demean each other, even though they are in reality two sides of the same coin. The left is written off wrongly as socialists and communists, and the right is written off as racist conspiracy theorists. So let's disarm the narratives and work towards a synthesis of dissent. If we are serious about structural change in this country, we need to re-examine not only what we believe, but how we've been taught to categorize each other. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen the emergence or reemergence of two significant currents of political dissent. On the left, we have those who have taken up anti-imperialism. They oppose wars of aggression, coercive sanctions, intelligence overreach, and military alliances that destabilize the global South under the pretense of promoting democracy and freedom. Much of this sentiment has clustered within the Democratic Party, or at least its outer margins, though most often rhetorical than real. There is a stated commitment in some progressive circles to diplomacy, multilateralism, and restraint. However, voting on foreign policy is always in lockstep between the two wings of the predator class bird. Only one or two politicians are permitted dissent for the benefit of optics. Everyone knows minimal objections can change an outcome. On the right, we have what's broadly described as the truther movement. This is less institutional and more populist. It includes those who question the official narrative surrounding major historical events, challenge the legitimacy of centralized authority, and express deep skepticism of corporate media, pharmaceutical monopolies, intelligence agencies, and the surveillance state. Much of this sentiment finds a home in the Republican or post-Republican spaces, libertarian, populist, even disillusioned conservatives. What's crucial to understand is that neither of these impulses is new, as Jeremy will discuss in detail today. The anti-imperialist tradition has deep roots in the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, in the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s, in figures like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. In Latin America, liberation theology and the post-colonial theorists who analyze the psychological and economic dimensions of empire. The truther instinct also has a long lineage, rising out of America's distrust of British monopoly, fueled by events like the Gulf of Tonkin, COINTELPRO, Watergate, Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, assassination of the Kennedys, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, mass surveillance, digital IDs, mandated medical treatments, and the corporate capture of government agencies by the pharmaceutical industry and global powers like the World Health Organization. These two traditions ought to be aligned. Both seek to dismantle systems of deceit and domination. Both recognize that official narratives often serve institutional power, not the public good. Yet again and again, we are told to view each other with suspicion. Anti-imperialists are smeared with Cold War era labels: communist, socialist, or un-American. These are not used to describe real ideologies, but to discredit them. Meanwhile, the truther movement is often dismissed with equally loaded terms: white supremacist, extremist, conspiracist. These labels are not used precisely or responsibly. They are used strategically to halt inquiry and fracture solidarity. And here is the critical insight: both sides are allowed to exist so long as they remain siloed, unfocused, and incapable of forming meaningful alliances. The Democratic Party gestures at anti-imperialism while continuing to fund wars, expand NATO, and support regime change by economic means. The Republican Party nods towards liberty and government skepticism, but folds into nationalism, deregulation, and corporate allegiance. The result is managed dissent, neutered criticism, just enough resistance to maintain the illusion of choice, but never enough to shift power. But what if these movements recognize their shared adversary? I can't say this word. Adversaries. Jayme, redo this one. But what if these movements recognize their shared adversaries? What if anti-democratic brought global analysis to domestic surveillance? What if the truther movement embraced a material critique of war and capital? What if instead of defending partisan brands, we defended truth, wherever it leads, and sovereignty, whoever demands it? This is not about merging ideologies. It's about converging strategies. Because while we argue over labels, bombs continue to fall, budgets continue to grow, lies continue to circulate, and power continues to consolidate. We have far more in common than we've been allowed to believe. And once we see through the smokescreen of fake ideological divides, once we stop accepting slander as analysis, we begin to see what's really possible. Thank you.
Well, very interesting analysis. I think, really, one thing we need is an anti-imperialist movement, and I argue in this article that we can look at American traditions. I mean, often they try and smear, the smear that people who are against American wars are anti-American, or look at these hippies, they hate America and everything it represents. That's a kind of stereotype. But I mean, if you look at American history, anti-imperialism is really ingrained in the country's DNA. And I think we have traditions we can draw on. I think to be effective, left-wing movements and anti-war movement need to draw on American traditions. And there is a tradition of an anti-imperialist movement, an anti-imperialist league. And so that's why I think now is a good time, especially with Trump proclaiming his fealty to William McKinley and saying that he was a great president. And Trump, is talking more openly about, direct forms of colonization, like he wants to take over Greenland, and he wants to take over Canada, and he wants to take back the Panama Canal. So, I mean, I think now is really a good time to revitalize the Anti-Imperialist League. And I think there's a limitation, as we've discussed on the show, there's a limitation of the anti-war movement in general, that they'll focus on one outrage of the day. The U.S. is now threatening war. Say it's on Iran now. It was, Libya yesterday. It was Afghanistan. It was Iraq. It was, Israel and Gaza, and the U.S. is supporting Israel and its aggression there. So we have to mobilize against that particular outrage or war. But I think, we have to look at developing more systematic critique at why the U.S. is always at war somewhere, and develop a permanent movement, not just against war, particular interventions, but like the protesters say they succeed in stopping some arms shipments to Israel. I mean, that would be a great success. But the warfare state is just going to go on, and they're going to find somebody else. So we need not just an anti-war movement, but an anti-imperialist movement that sees how the permanent warfare state and all the atrocities that come out of it are a result of, the capitalist system, and a result of the American quest for overseas dominance and empire. And we have a tradition we can invoke because for our movement, and that of the Anti-Imperialist League, which was set up in the late 19th century when the United States was transitioning from a continental empire to a global empire, with the crucial invasion of the Philippines in the late 19th, early 20th century, that foreshadowed the Vietnam War in many ways, and it resulted in basically a genocide of the Filipino population, which was quite unified in trying to fight for their independence and resist another foreign aggressor, because the United States was replacing the Spanish, who had colonized the Philippines. And there was a formidable movement that developed in the United States in opposition to the U.S. becoming a global empire. And they said very simply that the United States was formed in revolt against an empire, and it has a republican tradition and identity, and should not abandon that. And they warned that it would corrupt American democracy. A lot were worried that if the U.S. pursued overseas empire, then the totalitarian techniques that are adopted to run an empire and to wage colonial wars would blow back to the United States. The same officials involved would come back and use the same methods against those perceived as dissidents. And that's exactly what happened. They warned about it. Now, that movement had a lot of people of influence in it. It had some of the great men of letters of that era, like Mark Twain was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. It had a root on elite university campuses. The president of Harvard University, Charles Eliot, was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League, and he actually gave some great speeches denouncing U.S. crime in the Philippines. Imagine the Harvard president today doing that. And his star faculty was William Jayme, the father of modern psychology. And unlike the kind of academics we've been describing on this show, William Jayme was part of the Anti-Imperialist League. And he actually used a psychological analysis that this was kind of reflective of a backward stage of humanity, like I was saying about the Vietnam War and other colonial wars. So this was a very, very smart guy who was very influential in his field in academia, and had the stature of a Harvard professor, and wrote a lot of books. So these kind of people, and there were a lot of influential people. Yeah, it was headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. And you had a lot of wealthy people who were involved. And I'm not saying that's better than working class people. I'm just saying that it was quite respectable. There were members of Congress who were part of the League, and there was a real debate at that time. And there were members of Congress voicing their concern and opposition to the U.S. Imperial thrust in Southeast Asia that led ultimately to the Vietnam War. And they were worried in part that it would compromise American democracy at home and that it would lead to atrocities. And there's a book I reviewed written by Daniel Boone Shermer, written in the 1970s, that provided a very good overview of the Anti-Imperialist League. And there was a foreword by the famed historian Howard Zinn, and he made a lot of comparison with the Philippine War and Vietnam Wars. And yeah, it just showed that this movement was pretty effective because they were very good in promoting education. Like they weren't, and a lot of them were more of the upper class, so they weren't necessarily organizing protests or civil disobedience like the movement against the Vietnam War, but they promoted a lot of educational programs. They published pamphlets, and they were. So I think that's something I hope a new Anti-Imperialist League will form, and I'll be happy to be involved. If others are interested, they can contact us through the show, or I can give out my email, and perhaps we can get this started. And I think we would promote an educational program. And the original Anti-Imperialist League, they published a lot of pamphlets, and they dissected U.S. policy. And some they published, I think their most popular was they published a collection of soldiers' letters from the Philippines. As the war went on, it became clear how atrocious this war was, just like the Vietnam War or a more recent war like Iraq or Afghanistan or Israelis in Gaza. And they published a collection of letters from the soldiers. And it showed, that a lot of the soldiers had misgivings about what they were doing. And also it showed the racist barbarism that was going on. Because they would talk about hunting. They used the term gook, foreshadowing the Vietnam War. They said hunting gooks was more fun than hunting rabbits. Some of the soldiers wrote this in letters home, and they were published in this powerful volume. And a lot of people read that. And the Secretary of War at that time was a guy named Elihu Root, who was like Mr. Wall Street. He had been a Wall Street lawyer and was very anti-labor. And he was a founder of the Council of Foreign Relations. The Council of Foreign Relations is still very, very influential in trying to condition the public to support U.S. empire. And in fact, I have an article coming out in Covert Action later this year showing how they set up this front organization, the Committee on Foreign Relations, where they bring out speakers to the Midwest who promote a pro-empire viewpoint, and they censor alternative views. And I had this experience in Tulsa because I joined and I tried to get members of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity to speak. And the head, who was the president of the University of Tulsa, where I taught, and I knew him, I taught his son, he told me that, these are left-wing speakers and we can't have that. And he basically censored my speakers and refused to invite me after I sent him notice of some books I published, a book on the Clintons. He had some flippant comment about my book. So my point is, and he was Elihu Root was part of the Council on Foreign Relations. So what the Anti-Imperialist League can do is to promote its own educational program to counter this propaganda of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is Wall Street's think tank. And when they published that letters from soldiers, it was very powerful, undercutting Root, because Root had claimed our troops behave in the most civilized fashion. And they had this publication from the words of the soldiers themselves that showed exactly what William Jayme said, that this was a backwards, it reflected the animal-like nature of humanity. I mean, James had these kind of theories about different sides of, I guess, human psyche and nature. And to him, this reflected the animal-like nature and a return to kind of Stone Age barbarism. And the letters showed that, and it totally undercut what Elihu Root was saying. So it was powerful. And it showed the public how horrible this war was. And ultimately, the U.S. Government, well, McKinley was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt took over, and he was forced to withdraw U.S. troops from the Philippines. The public was outraged by its conduct, and the Anti-Imperialist League helped educate the public about the nature of the war and raised serious concerns about the U.S. becoming an empire. And as such, it led, I would argue, the U.S. to become more of an informal empire because overt forms of colonialism were discredited and seriously questioned. The U.S. government resorted to more indirect, covert forms of intervention in foreign countries. And that's why the CIA was set up and became so influential. And today's Anti-Imperialist League would have to fight against the covert operations that are imperialistic in nature. But we do have some role models to draw on from our own history. And that shows this is a wholly American movement. We're not anti-American in any way. We want our country to live up to its founding ideals. And that's our message. And that resonates among a huge swath of the American public.
Yeah, it does. The only problem is that, the good on both sides, the anti-imperialist side and also the truther movement, are at odds. And to really have a integrated base, we need to educate each side about the strengths of the other. So I think there's, and I also want to say, with Green Renaissance sovereign rights movement, that's a really good spot for this convergence between anti-imperialism and truther, because there's no politicking in there. So that is a good spot to have this develop. And Jeremy, I agree with you 1,000%, which is why we do the show. It is the need to allow people to think independently and to consider many different concepts and to get out of their comfort zone, because that comfort zone is a bit of a mental prison. And to really, try to listen to the opinions that others have. I mean, there's anti-imperialists, all over, and you've tried to talk to them about 9/11. They wouldn't hear it. And if you try to talk to a truther about anti-imperialism, they immediately say, "Oh, it's the communists or the socialists," and they won't hear of it. So it's really this need to have this broad education to break through these silos.
Well, yeah, and I think the anti-imperialist movement of the early 20th century was not a partisan movement. A lot of our uh, problems today result from this hyper-partisanship. So the movement I envision is not a partisan movement. So it may include conservatives, because conservatives venerate the U.S. Constitution and the founding ideals of the country. And a leftist might question that because the founding father, a lot of them were racist, and they actually envisioned the U.S. becoming a great empire, and they had no compunction about massacring the Native American population. So they don't want to venerate the leaders who did that. I mean, I can understand that point of view, but at the same time, I think social movements, to some extent, do need to draw on American ideal and traditions. They don't have to sugarcoat the founding fathers or make like they were saints. But there are aspects of American tradition that are very forward-thinking and positive, and I think those are the ones we have to draw on, and that will reach a wide audience. So, and that's something I think, like these student movements going on with the encampments. They're so focused on the Middle East, but I think they have to think strategically about how do you reach Middle America, how do you win their hearts, and I think there's a way to do that. And I think the energy in the truther movement, you can channel that. I mean, a lot of those people have the right mindset. They understand that the government very corrupt. There are a lot of corrupt things that went on. So I think you can build off that. And I think there's a way to try and reach that demographic. There are other demographics. The way you talk to people, the way you package your analysis. And I think if a new anti-imperialist league were to form, they would have to think about, but they would produce some literature that hopefully could reach those different demographics. And I mean, I think they do. As far as education, they can try and educate people about how false flag operations underlie a lot of these wars. And that's a technique of the ruling class and the ruling capitalist elite. I should point out that the Anti-Imperialist League, a lot of their analysis, they focused on the U.S. As a plutocracy, and that it was these financial speculators and financial interests that were driving the American empire that was not in the interest of the majority of the population. And I think that became
It's a very holistic perspective.
Yeah, that now might be considered a radical analysis, but then I think it was common sense. And a lot of people now are increasingly waking up to the fact that the United States is more of an oligarchy. And so we can, the truth is understand that there, these manipulation behind the scenes in these major historical events that are usually used as a pretext for major wars, like with 9/11 and the global war on terror. So, I mean, I think to educate people properly about the governing techniques and what's so evil about it, literature and analysis could be put forward about that. I mean, we've discussed that on this show. There's a lot of grounding. I mean, I'm a historian who deals with the facts. I'm not interested in wild theory. I'm interested in the facts and evidence that will validate that theory. And we have a ton of it in some of the cases we've looked at, whether the Oklahoma City, we could do future shows on 9/11 or whatever it is. So, but presenting good, educational program just presents good hard facts and evidence and analysis, and would try and bridge the divide together, because ultimately you need to unify those groups to present. You're dealing with a very coordinated and powerful group of people who are carrying out these morally bankrupt policy that we described on this show. So we need to build a huge coalition against that. And I don't have all the answers as to how to do that, but that's a challenge to try and bring those groups together. And one way I'm suggesting is that to draw on certain American movement and traditions that can't be labeled anti-American. When you're invoking Mark Twain, you're invoking the ideal of the American Revolution. It says American is apple pie, and that's going to resonate with a lot of people, because a lot of people do have misgivings, whether on the right or left, about these foreign wars. The elite knows that, and that's why they're trying to confuse and divide people. So we have to go try different strategies for going against that, what they're doing.
I mean, right now, the way the truther movement is, if you said, oh, would you like to join an anti-imperialist movement? They would be, you guys are all commies and socialists. No.
Well, not all of them. I live in Oklahoma, and I'm able to relate to a lot of these people. They
I'm just
may be able
saying
to get
the
beyond their
terminology.
stereotype. Because that's just, they're being fed that. The Trump movement feeds them that garbage. So, but if they actually meet, I mean, the other thing left-wing movement have to do is they have to go out in different communities, and I know that takes a lot of resources and commitment. The left doesn't have strong organizations or financing to do that. But if they can do that, that is key. If they can somehow find a way to go into those communities, hold forums. I think you have to go with the churches, and a lot of people are religious, and you may not be religious, but that's a way to reach people. You have to link up with local religious leaders. And there is a tradition. The past socialist movements were very strongly rooted in the church in the Midwest and Southern United States, and they invoke Christian ideals for creating more egalitarian and pacifist oriented society. So the left has to be smarter. I mean, and the left has been very bad tactically, and often just it just writes off people. Oh, they're reactionary, they're racist, they're these rural bumpkins. But these are real people, and if you talk to them with respect, and there is a way to reach them, and a lot of them are good people.
Well,
I
I
think
just
those organizing strategies have to be used.
I just remember a couple of years ago when the Libertarian Party was trying to organize a anti-war protest in Washington, and I think you attended that one, didn't you, Jeremy?
The Rage
The
Against the War Machine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and what the left did, or the so-called left did, and we refer to them as the invitation only anti-war left, because they didn't want to join this movement, the lockdown left. Thank you, thank you, Jayme. They didn't want to join this protest. They because they had misgivings about a few of the people that were involved in it. So instead of us having a uniform and cohesive anti-war movement, what we had was a fractured anti-war movement, and it was basically rendered ineffective. So you had two small protests with people kind of picking at each other and insulting each other, as opposed to one unified movement. So this is pure, COINTELPRO, in my opinion. Perhaps it's Jeremy's also, but we need to bridge that gap. We need to lay down our differences and focus on the points where we're all in agreement. And basically, again, back to what we try to do here on our show is educate both sides on the other, and look for the strengths and focus on the strengths and build on the strengths and stay away from the weaknesses.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that. And yeah, I mean, you can look at the Anti-Imperialist League. I mean, it didn't halt the U.S. drive for empire, but it did force it to become more covert. William Howard Taft, who was the U.S. president, he'd been Governor General of the Philippines. He came out and he gave a commencement address at Harvard, and he said, "You constrained us in what we could do." And that we had to remove a lot of our troops from the Philippines. Because the U.S., they left a small residual force in the Philippines to train a Filipino constabulary, kind of subcontract counterinsurgency, to do a lot of the dirty work in pacifying the nationalistic movement and the messianic peasant revolts, and to kind of fortify this hand-groomed neo-colonial government that the U.S. helped to install. So they went forward with that strategy, but they had to remove a lot of U.S. troops, and Taft said they felt constrained. So a larger anti-imperialist movement could start to put pressure on policymakers and could hopefully get some people into Congress who could raise these issues in the Congress and provoke real debate in the Congress, as some members of Congress did in the late 19th, early 20th century. And you had figures like Robert La Follette, who was a very progressive political figure from the state of Wisconsin, who spoke out against imperialism and U.S. intervention in World War I. William Jennings Bryan was the Secretary of State. He had been leader of the populist movement. He had been supportive of the Anti-Imperialist League, and he tried to prevent the U.S. from getting involved in World War I, and tried to block a loan that J.P. Morgan was giving to the French and British, that people warned would draw the U.S. into the war because they had to repay the loan. Bryan tried to block that. They ultimately fired him, but at least there was some conflict, and there was a lot of pressure on the elite, and they used strong arm methods to diffuse that. But if an even stronger movement could have pushed back further. So there's a lot that movement could achieve. It may not be magic end to the U.S. empire military bases and its 1,000 overseas bases, but it's needed to start the process of a pushback and to start to put some real pressure. So yes, we've got to get over that pettiness and build a wide movement. I mean, we live in America. We have to understand the political landscape as it is, not as we would like it to be. And we have to find a way to relate to these people in middle America. They may be Trump supporters. They may be libertarian, we may be on the left, but we do share some common goals and ideals, and we have to work from that place. And they're not all racist. I mean, and I may have had that attitude because I, got a job in Oklahoma, so I've lived here now for 15 years. And before I moved here, I was a little wary and did have a lot of stereotypes about the people. But living here, I've enjoyed living here. The people are very nice. I have a lot of good discussion with people on political issues. I find a lot of people are very open-minded, and some may be Trump supporters or libertarian. They may not have the exact same worldview as I have, but they do share certain common ideals, common concerns about U.S. foreign. I found a lot of critical attitude about U.S. foreign policy, foreign wars. A lot are libertarian. They are against government overreach, whether it's surveillance state. So there's a lot to work with there. So the left has a lot of opportunity, or anti-war movement, to go into these communities and try and relate to the people as they are and build them into a broader coalition. I'm not an experienced organizer, but I know that the successful organizers relate to people where they are, not to where they might want them to be. And that's how you have to operate from that. And you find there are a lot of good people, and we can get over a lot of that pettiness, I think, with time.
I think the Black Panthers were exemplary in this regard, and they would go into impoverished white communities. And I've seen some videos of this. It's really impressive. And they go into a room. It's all Confederate waving flag people, and then they start talking and teaching. And by the end, everybody's kumbayaing. It's amazing what education and listening to others can achieve. And this is what terrifies the predator class. That's one of the reasons they took out such wonderful leaders in the Black Panthers, especially in particular Fred Hampton. People who are unifying speakers, people who can reach into the hearts of opposition and connect. That's the danger. Dr. Martin Luther King, again, able to cross all kinds of lines and unite people. So but that's what's needed. And I mean, everyone who does the kind of, I guess, work that we're doing, you're doing it because you have a calling. There's this kind of impetus to just go out there and to do the right thing, and to try to work for peace. So I mean, I'm sure our show is touching some people and hopefully encouraging them to join in this effort and to devote some time to working for peace in some
I
capacity.
think we need to build community organizations. There are local peace groups. I think if those grow in a lot of cities, if those groups go bigger, grow stronger, and then that's what I'm proposing. We form a national organization, Anti-Imperialist League, modeled after the 1920th century, early 20th century Anti-Imperialist League, and that could be a way of bringing together local area peace groups and trying to do new recruitment drives. And education is very important. So publishing material or going out in schools, I think, is very important. And this thing could grow, I think, because a lot of people are concerned about the situation. I mean, a lot of what we've talked about on this show concerns everybody. And these are just immoral policies that benefit a very narrow elite and have caused a lot of mayhem and suffering in the world and have not been beneficial to the United States. And I think, you have to hammer that point home because people can see that. I mean, look at the budget that Trump is proposing. He's proposing for 2026 $1 trillion. He's cutting a lot of core social programs. At the same time, he's proposing raising the military budget over $1 trillion. And that's the trend we've seen, whether Democrat or Republican, upward and upward in the military budget, combined with cuts in core program that may benefit Americans. And I do take the point that there is some waste and efficiency in the government, So it may be legitimate to cut certain things down, but not to cut things like Social Security or Medicaid or labor organizations and the government that are there to enforce certain labor laws. So that's where I think any progressive draw the line. So, but this is a dangerous trend that whether you're conservative or liberal or more left, I think it's a trend, a dangerous trend for everybody. People are uncomfortable spending so much on military, especially when they know those wars are not wars that are universally popular. Ukraine has been very, very unpopular. It's really the conservative and Republicans who are the ones pushing back against it. The liberals have been these zealous war hawks, and that's why they've lost a lot of middle America. And that's why they're so unpopular, the party. There's zealous Russophobes. And if you come to middle America and talk to people, they're not very concerned about Russia. They don't know where their money is going in Ukraine. They don't see any benefit. So that's a popular position. So there's no reason you can't recruit a huge number of people to political. These people need to be organized into a movement that is against that huge military spending and against the U.S. and being involved in imperialistic intervention that bring no benefit to anybody except the president who profits.
There's two manipulations and psyops and engineering things that people have to overcome. And one of them is this concept that people are weak and can't do anything, that this is such a big problem that they should just ignore it. And, I go back to this rock song that, was like a mantra. You grew up on it. I can't, I'd like to save the world. I don't know if you remember this song, Jeremy. I'd like to save the world, but I don't know what to do. So I'll leave it up to you. So, these kind of, programming that the issues are so big and so complicated that you can't think about them. You just need to think about what are you having for breakfast, what do you have for dinner, what's on TV. So you're like brainwashed not to focus on these things. But the truth of the matter is, anything you do is a step forward. Even if you just say, hey, I saw this show Left on Left and I really liked it and I got a lot out of it. So maybe you should check out this show too. So maybe another person will watch our show and be influenced because of something you said. So just the slightest things can make a huge difference. So when you wake up in the morning, think of what you could do that really doesn't cost you anything, but could make a difference. Think in terms of being positive. And the other thing that we're kind of up against is this concept that if you think about world events or you think about political events or you think about economic events, that somehow that will make you depressed, that somehow that will limit you, that you only have this much capacity, and that's another psyop. We have tremendous capacity for love and joy and doing good things. We have tremendous capacity. And the more we do a good thing and something that makes us feel good and something that's positive, the more energy we get. And I'd say that's probably how Jeremy and I are able to do the show and why Jayme shows up, because there's something that we get out of it. We get out. You get something positive out of doing good. So don't be afraid to do good things, and don't be afraid to think, because you will feel empowered. The propaganda is wrong. The social conditioning is wrong. Doing good things results in positive stuff. So, Jeremy, back to you.
Well, I would say, we have a lot of political freedom in this country for all the problems and fear of growing authoritarian or totalitarianism. We still do enjoy, tremendous freedom to organize, to voice our point of view. So we may as well, I think it's imperative that we exhibit that liberty, take advantage of that liberty, and organize. I mean, that's even what the founding fathers envisioned, for democracy to function effectively. And Thomas Jefferson talked about the need for periodic revolts as the only way democracy can actually function, because otherwise government, if they're not held in check, they'll commit the worst of abuses of their power. And Jefferson said that and warned about that. So I think it is our obligation as citizens of the United States to take advantage of our liberties and to hold leaders accountable when they have misruled. And that is what has happened in our country. They are not ruling for the American population. They are ruling for corporate and self-interest, and they've carried out horrific policy that have harmed the American public in immeasurable ways, including the way the Anti-Imperialist League warned about, threatening our democracy, making us more of a repressive state, while they've waged wars abroad that have killed millions of people and that are unjustified wars. There are, I'm not an outright pacifist. There are certain conditions that would mark war as just, and that is a war of national self-defense, like the Vietnamese fought. However, the war the United States have waged have not been wars of national self-defense. They've been wars based on lies, and they've been imperialistic wars. And that's the supreme crime. The war of aggression is the supreme crime. So if we're not going to hold those criminals accountable, who will? It is our obligation, and we have the freedom to do that. They're not going to throw us. As of now, they're not yet throwing us in concentration camps or prisons. So we have the liberty to try and organize in a peaceful manner against those usurpers of government authority. And I believe that is our moral obligation.
To go back to Scott Camille, which is from an earlier show we did on Vietnam, one of the things that he was motivated by through social engineering and psyops and all kinds of stuff like that was this message that if they didn't kill the Vietnamese people, that this communist concept would attack the United States. So even though the United States is a invading and occupying power, the spin was that if we're not an invading and occupying power, they're going to invade and occupy the United States. So you are fighting them to protect the women and children back in the United States, which is the most ridiculous thing you could imagine. But that's what's used all the time. That, if we don't do X, Y will happen. So we could basically kill everyone with impunity, steal everything, oil, gold bullion, resources. And if you study sanctions, that's exactly what we do. And we say, oh, we've frozen the assets. We've frozen the assets. No, we haven't frozen anything. What we've done is we've stolen the assets. We've pirated their ships. We've pirated their oil. If you look at what's happened to Venezuela in particular, and but that's okay. I mean, this rules-based order is the rules are only one way, and they're basically for the corporate elite, because that bounty and that's brought from these other countries doesn't go to the American people. No, it goes right into the pockets of the bankers. And Jeremy is a historian. I'm not, but I'm drawn to like Smedley Butler and his comment that war is a racket. Do you want to speak a little bit about the racket aspect of war and why this is happening? Like, why war? War's a moneymaker, guys. It's the biggest way to have a redistribution of income.
Well, and on the first point, enough people understand what you're saying, that if they organize together, they could actually present an effective front in trying to counter what they're doing. And as far as Smedley Butler, yeah, he was part of the Anti-Imperialist League formally, I think, disbanded After the U.S. scaled back on its intervention in the Philippines, it kind of lost momentum. There was a guy, Moorfield Story, who kept the organization alive till about 1920, and then he passed away. But the United States did have colonial occupations in Nicaragua and Haiti in the late 19-teen, early 20s, but those were also scaled back in the mid 20s. And there were some anti-imperialist members of Congress, like Ernest Gruening actually was one of the two to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I believe he was a Republican from Alaska. He spoke out against the U.S. Marine occupation of Nicaragua in the late teen, early 20s when he started his congressional career. There was a guy, William Borah from Montana, who was anti-imperialist. There was Robert La Follette, who ran for president in 1924 as an independent and had a considerable following. So there were people of influence who were part of the anti-imperialist movement, and some of them had been in the Anti-Imperialist League. There were a lot of politicians in it and members of Congress. So that's what we should strive for today. And it would be important because we have no debate in Congress about the U.S. as an empire. We have only a small number of congressmen who oppose certain wars, but they never opposed the idea of the U.S. as an empire with 800 to 1,000 overseas military bases. And as far as Smedley Butler, yeah, he reflects a tradition of military dissent and anti-imperialism in the military. And we should draw on that today, that spirit. And I used to have a friend, he was a Korean War veteran when I taught at a college in Massachusetts, the librarian, and I were friendly, and he taught a course, and we used to discuss stuff, and he was pretty, had a kind of similar outlook as I did on a lot of things. And one day he invited me to a protest because he was a Korean War veteran, and he said, "Oh, I'm part of the Smedley Butler Brigade, the Veterans for Peace. Why don't you come? We're having a protest." And this was the Iraq War was going on the Boston Common. And then I met all his friends. They were bombers in Korea and Vietnam, and they told me how genocidal the U.S. policy was in Korea and Vietnam and how ashamed they were, the terrible thing they did, but they didn't know better when they were young. But now they educated themselves, and they know better, and that's why they're part of the Smedley Butler Brigade. But Smedley Butler was a 5-star general who served in the Philippines and in these Latin American banana wars. And then when he retired from the military, he said he had been a racketeer for capitalism and big business, and he gave speeches across the country denouncing the U.S. military and imperialism. And he said, Al Capone had nothing on him and the U.S. Marines. They operated on 6 continents, he said, and they raped Latin American republics for Wall Street. These are Smedley Butler's words. So we got to invoke that, and he wrote a book about World War I, and I show it to students. And his book, he had the statistics about how much some of these arms companies made in World War I, and the DuPont company. And then the second half of the book was all pictures of soldiers who had their gruesome photos of soldiers who had their head blown off or lost an arm. Some were dead, some were half dead. And it was meant to shock and show this is what war does to young men, and these are the people who profited off it and drove it. And that's what the Anti-Imperialist League could publish, new pamphlets like that. And we can draw on people in the military. There are people dissenting in the military today and who know the truth about war. So we can spotlight them and what they experience. And I had a lot of students, and they were, when I was teaching at various colleges, who had been in Iraq, Afghanistan, and they were the most radical students. And they would tell other students, some didn't want to talk about it, others were not shy, and they would raise their hand in class and say, I was in Iraq, and this is the horrible thing that I saw and what we did over there. We'd be covering some historical topic. And he's like, I know what you're talking about. So these would be valued assets. And there are others like Butler, they know from experience really what it's all about, and they know how oppressive an institution the military can be. So, there's a great tradition there of truth tellers, and there's no reason not to establish a more formidable anti-imperialist movement today that could reach a wide swath of the public and really start to put the pressure on the Al Capones of our lifetime.
I was able to look up the song that I had referenced. It's called "I'd Love to Change the World," and it was performed and I believe written by 10 years after. And you know the verse in particular, it's "I'd love to change the world, but I don't know what to do, so I'll leave it up to you." No, that's not what we say here at LOL. We say we want to change the world and we know what to do, so go do it.
Yeah, and history showed that these movements are effective. I would underscore it's not futile because Taft said that they put a lot of pressure on them. He said in the Harvard commencement. And, there's been some new scholarship on the Vietnam War, like Carolyn Eisenberg wrote a study, and people like Kissinger were quoted as saying, we couldn't do more because of the anti-war movement, those pesky anti-war activists. We couldn't bomb Cambodia totally to smithereens because there would be a revolt in Chicago. So these movements do have an impact. They constrain policymakers, and if they grow bigger, they can ultimately change the nature of power in America. So the sky is the limit, I would say.
And I forgot what the tipping point is. Maybe you recall it for social change. I think you need, was it 10%? It's a very small percent of the population to be active, to actually have a tipping point. Do you recall what it is off the top?
Yeah, a small numbers can catalyze a huge number of people to in turn make a huge difference. So I don't know what the specific numbers are, but and we've seen a lot of social movements in our own time, whether the Black Lives Matter or the current campus protests. And whatever criticism we may have of the limits of those movements, it represents an opportunity. It means that there are a lot of young people who are questioning what's going on, who are recognizing injustice, whether it's in the realm of race relations or the Israel-Gaza. So I think what we're asking for in this show is that we need to channel these impulses or the truther movement into a much larger anti-imperialist movement and a real left-wing movement that pushes for a fundamental transformation of the U.S. political economy. And I think it is realistic because the current system is failing Americans and it's failing people all around the world.
ChatGPT says it's 10%, which is kind of what I recall when I looked into this a long time ago. But yeah, so we don't really need these massive numbers. We just need a few people to do something positive every day.
But
Jeremy.
we need to build movements. We need organization. That's why it's something like the Anti-Imperialist League, that was concretely effective. Not just one person, but it was a significant number of people and doing constructive work, whether it's education, whether it's protest rallies to raise awareness. I mean, protest rally, even small rallies in a community. I've been part of groups that had a weekly picket when I lived in a small town. I mean, it just raised awareness of that issue, and the group slowly grew because people passed by and they were interested, and you talked to them, and then they joined the group. So that's how you grow. So
and donations make a difference too, because pamphlets cost money, and airtime and this and that. Things cost money. So even you can donate, and that's making a difference too to something positive. Jeremy, please tell our audience how they can follow your important work and financially support your efforts. And also, LOL, we've got a Substack now because Jeremy and
visit our Substack at Left on Left, and I have my own Substack at Too Hot for the Mainstream, and I also am a managing editor of Covert Action magazine, and most of my articles are published there, and sometimes they're also published with my Substack. Occasionally, I write some unique articles for the Substack.
Well, that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here today by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right, there we go. Thank you, guys. That was great. One thing I want to chime in with, Trump is like, he's idolizes William McKinley. and his tariffs. And he because he loves the economy, the way he thinks the economy was great during that time. But what he doesn't,
I'm gonna
I
have
know
to
you got to
leave
run.
Yeah,
because
I gotta run
the
too, because
exterminator is coming. I'm so
yeah.
sorry.
All
All
right.
right,
Well,
we'll discuss this
let
more
me
later.
finish.
Yeah.
Get out of here, Gloria. Let me finish this thought with Jeremy real
Okay,
quick.
quickly, because I gotta
Um,
run too.
Well, I just think it's funny that he wants to bring that era back because he thinks the economy was great from that time. But that was at the end of the Gilded Age, which was one of the worst times of worst periods of history for the American people in regards to the economy.
Yeah.
So his plan is to return us to one of the worst periods of
Yeah,
time
and there were no
in order
labor
to fix the
protection. There
economy.
were like horrific workplace conditions at that time that led to
Yeah.
incidents like the Triangle Fire, where they had no safety in the building, and a fire died, and they all had to jump to their death because the safety, there were no safety regulations in factories and companies. So, yeah, it's just an ignorance of history. Anybody who follows that.
And he's claiming to do it for the working class. It's like, well, wait, do you mean you want to re-enslave the working class like they were during the Gilded Age? Because
Yeah,
that's what you're
exactly.
proposing.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, thank you guys for doing the show today, and we'll.
Yeah, thanks, Jayme.
We
So I
are
guess we'll be.
pre-recorded.
Which one should I put up now on the Substack? Like, is that mineral one ready yet? Or
The first one we did will go up today. This one we're recording today, which people are watching now live because it's a premiere for YouTube. Is going to be on May 22nd.
okay, great.
All right.
All right,
Well,
take care, Jayme. Thanks so much for your work.
yeah. Thank you for doing the show. It was a good show today.
Okay.
All right. So, and thank you for watching us. I know this was a pre-recorded episode, but we got to do what we want to do, and we wanted to make sure we had episodes to keep releasing every week. So, on behalf of Pasta to Go, this is a presentation by Craig Pasta Jardula. So, we're coming up on 100th episode. I'm going to try to see if he can get his butt back into the studio to join us for that episode. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, get out of here, but we'll be back next week, and spread the word about the show. We feel like we're doing good work. We know we've rattled a few cages with certain people who are paying attention, and we think that's a good thing. So keep watching and spread the word, and we'll be back. We'll see you next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye, everybody.